Hello, and welcome to Allies, a series of videos where we talk about Ukraine's friends, their foreign and domestic policies, and their evolving relationship with Ukraine. Joining us today is Maria Popova, Professor of Comparative Government and Politics at McGill University. Professor, welcome.
Hi.
In Ukraine, we know quite little about Canada, its foreign and domestic affairs, beyond the large presence of Ukrainian diaspora in the country. Perhaps that is because the country is quite far away from Ukraine, perhaps because the United States, its powerful neighbor, gets most of the attention among the countries in the region. Therefore, one task that I see for this conversation is to understand the Canadian political landscape in relation to Ukraine. However, we also know that Canada has helped Ukraine a lot since 2014. For example, the country provided training to more than 33,000 Ukrainian troops. Thus, we also want to calibrate our understanding of just how much assistance we can expect from Canada down the line. To start with, we'll talk about the political background in Canada with relations to the war. So first of all, we want to understand what was Canada's reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and if there have been any major protests or notable public initiatives in support of Ukraine. Is it kind of a public-driven effort, or do Canadians rely more on the government to do well in this regard?
It's a very good question. I think the immediate reaction beyond the shock and horror of what was going on was Canadians immediately got to fundraising. There were solidarity marches. So there was a public reaction, but at the same time, there is an overwhelming expectation shared in Canada that Canada is a long-standing ally and partner of Ukraine, and there's no need to really push the government to do the right thing. Two-thirds, I saw some recent polls that show that two-thirds of Canadians are closely or very closely following the war. Even in March, even in May of 2022. So public attention is there, but there is also an expectation that the government will be doing well because this is sort of a consensus issue within Canada.
So I guess you brought up an interesting point. There is also the role of the media. So would you say that this attention is driven kind of by genuine interest, or is it kind of the media story, or is it really both at the same time?
It's probably both. There is an expectation within the media that they need to cover this story because there's a large Ukrainian Canadian population that are interested in the story, in addition to the story being a top story in the world anyway. So the media is interested, and the public is also demanding this attention, I think, because for example, I did quite a few call-in interviews with radio stations in Canada where, I was available to answer questions, and there was absolutely no shortage of questions. A lot of Canadians are interested in this topic, and they were calling in by the dozen.
That's great to hear. And so you're saying that basically this attention is still there and kind of not going away. I guess my question is, what are the angles that are being discussed? So, for example, in Ukraine, or well, maybe I guess in Europe as well, people talk about the possible food shortages and how that might affect the migration flows from North Africa and stuff like that. So, what would be the kind of narratives that are present in Canada?
I think Canadians are interested mostly in sort of how the war is going. Will Ukraine be able to recapture its territories? How are things progressing? Is there a chance for negotiations of some sort to bring peace sooner rather than later? So I think it's more of an interest in Ukraine and in the situation on the ground than necessarily interest in how will this affect Canada. I think Canada, to some extent, is sufficiently far away to not be worried first and foremost about its own security, about economic impact on Canada. I mean, there's been a bit of discussion of how sort of a global food shortage may affect prices in Canada potentially, but this is sort of a secondary topic of discussion. I think the main interest is, will Ukraine be able to win this war?
I see. Well, that's great to hear that the topic is staying hot. Another question with regards to the media is the presence of Canadian volunteers fighting for Ukraine. Does that topic get a lot of media coverage? Is that something that the media discusses?
Interestingly enough, not a lot. There is not a lot of coverage on Canadians who have gone to fight in Ukraine. There's more coverage of how refugees from Ukraine are making it in Canada and how Canadian civil society is helping them integrate and helping them, find places to live, work, etc. So I would say that there's more emphasis on Ukrainians coming to Canada than Canadians in Ukraine.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I guess we got a little sidetracked here with talking about the media, but back to the kind of political questions, I suppose. So the question is twofold. Who are the supporters for Ukraine, and if there are any opposers? Basically, we're talking about public figures, entertainers, politicians, whoever it is, really.
So the interesting thing is that there is really broad political consensus in support of Ukraine in Canada. Really, the support is across the political spectrum. You have major politicians from every single party that have expressed strong support for Ukraine. So the to give us as examples, Ukrainians may be familiar with the fact that the finance minister, Christopher Freeland, from the Liberal Party is of Ukrainian descent. So she is, of course, a vocal supporter of Ukraine, but also Bob Rae, who is from the NDP, so the left of center party, and is now serving as Canada's ambassador in the UN, has also been very active in supporting Ukraine and the cause and sort of making the point that Ukraine can win this war, making this optimistic point, and Ukraine should get all the support it needs. On the conservative side, there's also support for this war because the Conservative Party on the right is traditionally the party that is more concerned about defense and security. So from that angle, they also see Russia's aggression as a huge threat to security, to NATO and the Western world. So they're also supportive of Ukraine. The Conservative Party right now is in the midst of figuring out who their next leader is going to be. And the front runner, Pierre Poilievre, has also stated that Canada needs to help Ukraine even more than it's helping right now. He is not very active on the issue since he's fighting right now an internal fight for the nomination to lead the Conservative Party. So foreign policy is not really his focus right now, but from what he has said on the issue, if anything, he wants Canada to do even more. So there is very little opposition to helping Ukraine in Canada. I've seen some polls. It's about 10% of the population that has some reservation about about Canada perhaps doing too much to help Ukraine. So it's a small proportion of the population. Probably the place where in the spectrum where that is sort of the right-wing members of the Conservative Party, of the right of center party. And there has been some sort of connections made between the trucker convoy that had occupied Ottawa in early February in protest of COVID restrictions and some support for Russian narratives about this war. So where this intersection is really is you see this small segment of the Canadian population that is not supportive of Ukraine is usually the segment of the population that consumes disinformation narratives of all kinds. And that includes Russian disinformation narratives.
That's a great point. And actually, I think about 2 days ago, Jordan Peterson, I guess an intellectual of sorts of Canada's origin, who's quite popular in Ukraine, by the way, actually released a video on the war in Ukraine where he references John Mearsheimer and just overall kind of has this conservative explanation for why the West should not support Ukraine. So I'm not surprised to hear that those ideas permeate on the right wing. Let's put it that way.
Right. Jordan Peterson is not a particularly Canadian figure. I mean, he is, of course, from Canada.
Not anymore.
But I don't think he has necessarily bigger clout here in his home country. And of course, I wasn't surprised by his position on the war.
I think many in Ukraine actually were surprised because in Ukraine he's quite popular, actually, I would say, among conservatives again.
Right.
Especially the young ones. All right. Well, moving on. Another interesting question is there any difference in views between the Anglophone and the Francophone communities, and kind of what narratives are dominate in each of these groups with regards to the war?
There isn't a lot of difference. Maybe there is there's slightly more attention in Anglophone Canada to the issue because the Ukrainian Canadian diaspora is English speaking and is from Western Canada predominantly. So there's also within Quebec a little bit in the beginning, there was a bit of an expectation within Quebec, within the Francophone community, that Canada will, of course, be a strong supporter of Ukraine because the Ukrainian diaspora will be pushing the government to do a lot. So the only difference may have been, a little bit more salience in the English media than in the French media. But I think that was only in the beginning. Over time, over the past 5 months, the Francophone media has also covered the war extensively and is basically producing the same narratives about the war as in the rest of Canada. I don't see a major difference at all.
Okay. Well, we've been referencing the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada a couple of times already. So what, obviously beyond the representation on high levels such as Krista Freeland, what kind of grassroots initiatives have we been seeing from the diaspora? What kind of activities have they been pursuing after the war broke out?
The Ukrainian Canadian diaspora is very well organized. There are many organizations. the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, but others as well. And they immediately hit the ground running with fundraising for humanitarian causes. They are also active in shaping the media narrative because they talk to the media a lot. So they are very active. They've been active also in sort of promoting the idea that fundraising for Ukraine should go directly to Ukrainian sources and organizations, not to international organizations like the Red Cross, where money can be blocked for a long time. So I think they've been very active, working in overdrive, so to speak, and they take active positions on every issue that comes up on a daily basis. Like, for example, right now, as the Canadian government has decided to return this turbine to this Russian turbine that has been in Canada for a few months, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress is considering launching a court case to try to force the government to change its position. So they're immediately advocating and immediately trying to advocate for Ukrainian interests.
Well, that's great to hear, and we'll definitely get to talk about the turbine later on in the future. But just like to comment on one of the things you said is that I've been meaning to write an article about this myself, but this situation with international organizations, I think that's a very, very good initiative because, when we have, some celebrities collecting millions of dollars in support, really using their status as a celebrity to help Ukraine, but then, that money goes to, United Nations or UNICEF, and those organizations they often are understaffed in Ukraine, and they might not be as effective as the local NGOs that have these sort of ground up networks. So it's really great to hear that Canadians are working in this direction, that Canadian Ukrainians are working in this direction.
Yeah, they're just aware of these issues more.
Yeah, that's true. So we'll be switching to our next section, where I guess we'll be talking about the military support of Canada for Ukraine, as well as the kind of capability of Canada militarily. So I guess let's start with the first question. The argument goes oftentimes when we talk about the European states is that many of them cannot actually provide significant military assistance because their own militaries are too small. So, do you believe that the same can be argued about Canada's military, or can it do more? Does it have the capability to do more to help Ukraine militarily?
So this is a really, really good question. I mean, Canada has offered so far about 500 million in military aid to Ukraine, which is unprecedented in the country's recent history. And it has also fulfilled the commitments sort of quickly after announcing them, unlike Germany. But the thing to keep in mind is that Canada does not spend a lot on its own military. We are far from meeting NATO's requirement that defense spending should reach 2% of GDP as a minimum, and preferably more. Canada's ratio of defense spending to GDP is actually closer to 1.3, even under 1.3 for this year. So it seems that Canada has done quite well given the limited resources that it's operating with. I saw some statistics that showed that Canada is among the countries that have committed moderately high amounts of military aid, comparable to Lithuania, Greece, higher than Germany or France. And in terms of bilateral aid, Canada has done quite well too. It has contributed as a percentage of GDP more than any other Western country after the US and the UK. So while there may be room for doing better, it's not a lot of room. I think the Canadian government has tried to do well.
Okay, yeah, I think it's in the top five, top six in terms of support. I would maybe push back on what you said about the it's have it one of the highest percentage of GDPs because there are the Baltic states, and I think we had a speaker from Latvia where we really established that they spend such a big part of their defense expenses overall. But the next question, I guess, is there such a thing as a military industrial complex in Canada? Are there a lot of, weapons manufacturers? For example, maybe you say that, Canada doesn't make so much for its own military, but maybe it exports, for example. So is there this kind of informal alliance or a lot of kind of weapons producers?
It's a good question, but there isn't a very big military industrial complex in Canada. There are some producers, but they're not major producers of military equipment. I mean, the reality is that that Canada is to a large extent relying for its own security on the US and on cooperation with the US. And in terms of Canada's vision of itself, it has always, or not always, but in the last 50 years or so, it has created this vision for itself as a nation committed to peacekeeping, and in fact, the nation that invented peacekeeping, and therefore, defense spending has always been de-emphasized, and there's a sense, there's an identity within Canada that we don't do war, we do peace. I mean, obviously, in this war, this is clashes with Canada's commitment to help Ukraine, because Ukraine has to win this war first before we can talk about peace. It's not a situation in which peacekeeping is relevant right now, right? So that's a bit of a clash between, on the one hand, Canada's commitment to peacekeeping usually, and Canada's commitment to helping Ukraine right now.
Okay, and touching on what you said about Canada relying on the U.S. Um, Recently, Canada supplied Ukraine with about, I think it was 20,000 ammunition for artillery. And on the official Canadian sources, it says that that was sourced from the United States. So does that basically mean that Canada would not have those kind of production facilities that produce, for example, munitions for the artillery?
Yeah, so there is one producer of ammunition in Canada, but it's not a big producer. So,
Okay.
so they probably didn't have the capacity to supply this themselves, and that's why it was sourced from the U.S. It's not surprising.
Okay, well, what is surprising though is that Canada recently decided to supply Ukraine with 39 brand new Super Bison armored personnel carriers. And these are the kinds of vehicles that haven't really been used too much in Canada's military service because they're relatively new. But the country chose to divert these resources to Ukraine. So the question is, is this a regular practice? And if not, why has Canada decided to follow through with delivering this equipment to Ukraine when most other partners they tend to send their old or excess equipment to Ukraine?
Yeah, it's not regular practice. It is a reflection, I think, of the fact that the Trudeau government is under pressure from the Canadian electorate to do well, to support Ukraine as much as they can. Both because Canadians perceive themselves as a strong ally of Ukraine, but also because the Liberal Party, Trudeau's party, is generally perceived as being the weaker party on defense. So he has to show that, in fact, he is doing well on defense as well. And as a result, has to make a commitment that is going to be appreciated by Ukraine and is going to get attention as Canada delivering really on strong commitments to supporting Ukraine.
That's an interesting point, and I guess with regards to that, just kind of a jump-in question. So, who would be winning the next presidential or parliamentary elections in Canada? Would you say that Trudeau stays, or should we expect conservative candidate instead?
Yeah, it's a tough question because we don't know yet who the conservative leader will be. If the conservative leader is indeed Pierre Poilievre, the front runner right now in the conservative race, we can expect a more spirited election between Trudeau and Poilievre. And a more polarizing election than previous Canadian elections. So it's really hard to make a prognosis, but it will be probably a more competitive election, which will be decided during the campaign. Sort of the outcome will be decided during the campaign. Going into it, we wouldn't know, is Trudeau safe and could he get another minority or even a majority government, or will he for sure lose? It's way early to make a guess about that. But I think regardless of who the next prime minister will be, I think the commitment to supporting Ukraine will be strong.
Touching on another point that you brought up earlier, that is kind of the coordination or maybe even the partial dependence of Canada on the United States as in security matters. How would you describe this relationship in terms of the military assistance and foreign policy of Canada and the US? It's particularly, perhaps, we could say that it's particularly visible in this case, or we could say that it's not. But what is kind of the broader history of this cooperation?
So there's a very strong relationship in defense matters between Canada and the US. Canada and the US have operated a permanent joint board on defense since 1940. It's a permanent board to discuss and to advise on defense policy issues related to North America. The US president and the Canadian prime minister meet twice a year to discuss defense policy issues as part of this permanent joint board. So it's close, continuous cooperation over decades and decades. In addition, there is the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, which was established in 1958, so also a long time ago. It's based in the States, in Colorado, but the deputy commander of NORAD has always been, or traditionally been, a senior Canadian Armed Forces officer. So there is really very close and continuous cooperation between the two states on defense issues. I mean, some may say that Canada is kind of free riding on American security, but on the other hand, the U.S. also has a very reliable partner in Canada, and can work together, can rely on Canada within NATO. Canada has rarely challenged or sort of abstained from supporting the U.S. The war in Iraq is one big exception that sort of confirms the rule that in general Canada supports the U.S. in foreign and defense policy.
So with the defense policy, I think your answer is pretty clear. But yeah, so with foreign policy, you would say too, it's the same kind of symbiotic relationship in most cases.
Well, I mean, in foreign policy, it really kind of depends on who is in power, either in the U.S. or in Canada. There is more partisanship to that and more differences, but defense policy is quite well integrated.
Okay, so I guess we'll be smoothly transitioning to the foreign policy section of this conversation. And here, I did want to ask you in general to understand Canada's foreign policy. What are, for example, its top three priorities, and how has the war changed them?
So the top priorities for Canada, I mean, for Canada or for the current Canadian government, it
Well,
depends
let's
on what level of sort of generality we talk about here. But among a big priority for Canada has been sort of peacekeeping and this idea of working within international institutions to bring peace, to support peacekeeping missions around the world. So that has been a big part of, as I mentioned already, sort of Canada's identity, its vision of itself over the last few decades. And in this particular war, this comes, there's tension between this and Canada's commitment to helping Ukraine win the war militarily, because there really isn't a lot of room right now for pushing a peacekeeping agenda. So that's one way in which I think the war has changed Canada's foreign policy priority, in the sense that now there is a greater sense that Canada needs to invest in its position within NATO to maybe to boost defense spending in order to be a solid contributor to NATO's joint defense. So this is one major way in which the war has affected foreign policy priorities.
Certainly, and beyond NATO, beyond kind of defense and military spending, I think another important component of this war has arguably been energy and energy security. So the question here, I guess, is that Canada does export, for example, gas, but it mostly exports, as far as I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, to the United States. So the question is, can it play a more active role in supplying energy resources to, say, Europe? Does it have the capacity and willingness to export energy resources, perhaps beyond gas, to Europe?
So there has been increasing discussion around this since the war started. There is some capacity and there is willingness within Canada to think about how to develop it. The key, though, is that it would have to happen in the medium term rather than in the short term, because new infrastructure will be needed. So at the end of the G7 summit, Trudeau mentioned that there will be opportunities, that Canada is interested in developing facilities that could export liquefied natural gas to Europe. He didn't go into a lot of specifics, but But he did say that this will be a goal in the medium term because there's some infrastructure that needs to be built in order to make this happen. The infrastructure can then be used for hydrogen exports in the future, which is also consistent with his foreign with his policy priority in terms of climate, longer term climate goals. So I think we can expect some work in the future in that direction.
It certainly does take some time to build that infrastructure, which is, it seems that it's kind of something that we keep coming back to. Countries, including in Europe, kind of very carefully considering these investments and kind of thinking about how long the war is going to last before investing in these really long-term initiatives that require quite a bit of upfront money. Meanwhile, if we talk about energy in Canada, obviously the recent news has been full of the talk about the gas turbine that Canada might provide and will probably agree to provide for Germany, which is an exception for sanctions for a German Russian enterprise that is Nord Stream 1. I suppose today there has actually been a piece of news, I think, that said that Russia says that their issues with Nord Stream 1 will continue. So it might be debatable about if it's really the gas turbine that is the problem. But do you believe that this kind of exception from the sanctions is a dangerous precedent? And the other question is, in general, what is Canada's interest here? Like, why would what does Canada get out of this?
So it seems that what happened was that Canada sort of yielded the pressure from Germany to return the turbine. And Trudeau today tried to frame this as sort of Western unity and to say, we're not going to yield to the weaponization of energy by Russia. The reason we did this is that there would be unity between NATO allies, Canada and Germany. So when Germany asked, Canada delivered. The idea is that Russia would not have an excuse in the turbine to continue stopping gas deliveries to Germany and to blackmail Germany this way. But I do think it's an unfortunate precedent. I think rather than sort of diffusing weaponization of energy, as Trudeau said, it really actually creates a precedent where two allies are yielding to blackmail and to pressure from Russia through the weaponization of energy. So I think overall it's an unfortunate decision by the Trudeau government. Basically, instead of Canada as the traditional and strong supporter of Ukraine, convincing Germany to stand strong and firm on applying the sanctions to Russia, Canada caved to Germany's often weak and ambivalent position in this war. So I think down the line, Trudeau will be criticized for this decision. I mean, let's see how it turns out in the end. But my prediction would be that down the line, he will be he will pay a political price for this decision domestically, as I think more people within Canada would be concerned about strong support for Ukraine and tough sanctions on Russia than, what is Germany going to do during the winter. So I think Ukraine is more important to the Canadian electorate than Germany is. So in my assessment, politically, he miscalculated.
I certainly think that it's a problem from the Ukrainian perspective, but I also believe that in a way it might be actually kind of helpful if that turbine is delivered and Russia continues to escalate the situation, to speculate on the work of Nord Stream 1 despite the delivery of the turbine. Perhaps it will have to kind of open its cards sooner than sooner that it would want to.
Yeah, I mean, it might be part of the calculus as to why they decided not to dig in on the turbine. And it may be one of the reasons why the US has declared support for Trudeau's decision. So indeed, it really depends on how this entire process plays out in the future to see whether ultimately it will be a politically neutral decision for the Canadian government or potentially a detrimental one.
Certainly, it will really depend on well, the Russian reaction to this initiative.
Right.
As we're moving on to the end of our conversation, there are just some interesting questions about kind of the past and the future. So I guess there will be one for each. So before the war, did Canada believe that it would take place? Was it something that it was seriously considering? You know, we talked about the kind of security cooperation between the U.S. And Canada, and the U.S. was one of the few countries, perhaps together with Great Britain, that was actively peddling the notion that the war is indeed going to come, whereas the Europeans were kind of hesitant. So where was Canada on that?
So I think Canada was quite close to the US position as a country that has been deeply involved in Ukraine's ongoing resistance to Russian aggression since 2014. I think Canada and the Canadian government was quite clear-eyed about what Russia's goals in Ukraine are. So I don't think they were shocked. I also don't think that there was a lot of hope within the Canadian government that this could be that this war could have been avoided through some sort of diplomacy and negotiations. Soon after the war started, I gave testimony to the Canadian Parliament, both the Senate and the House, on sort of why the war started and what happened. And as I prepared for this testimony, I actually prepared for a lot of questions where I expected to be pushed on the question of could we have avoided this war by pressuring Ukraine to deliver concessions in line with the Minsk Accords, and could diplomacy have prevented this war? But in fact, I didn't get many of those questions at all. I think only one question along those lines, which to me really signaled that the Canadian government was and the Canadian political parties were quite clear on the fact that Russia was pursuing an aggressive policy towards Ukraine, and an invasion was sort of likely.
So I guess the last question is about the future. Can Ukraine expect more assistance from Canada, and what shape will this assistance take, given, as we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, perhaps Canada is not bent on defense spending of its own? What kind of assistance can we expect in the future?
I think Canada will definitely be committed long term to helping Ukraine in whichever way it's necessary. As I mentioned, regardless of what government is in power, there won't be a lot of debate on whether we, as Canadians, should be supporting Ukraine or not. The consensus is on yes. And recent discussion is pushing towards Canada increasing defense spending. So I think military assistance will continue. The Liberal government has committed to increasing defense spending over the next 5 years. If they stay in power, I think that's where they're going to go. And so I think, and of course, if Ukraine wins this war soon and there is a big reconstruction effort, Canada will be an active participant in it. It's already prepared, given the assistance that Canada has provided on issues such as rule of law reform and electoral monitoring, etc. So Canada already has a track record of helping Ukraine. So I think that will continue.
Yeah, it's certainly great to hear, and it's a really important aspect of this war about the recovery of Ukraine from it. And it's good to hear that Canada is kind of both focused on the present, which is arguably kind of more important winning the war, protecting Ukraine, but also on the future, which is going to be really important couple of years down the line from now. Just a reminder to our viewers that today we talked about Canada's domestic and foreign policies as they relate to the war in Ukraine and the relationship between Ukraine and Canada. Please subscribe to our channel and check out our videos on the relationship between Ukraine and other partners. We recently had a talk with an expert from Latvia where we talked a lot about the defense spending, so you'd benefit a lot from that discussion. And Professor, thank you once again for sharing your expertise. It's been great to have you on with us.
Thanks for having me.